really a paraphrase, a summarized version of the entire Bible. That there is plenty that they have said, hey, we are not going to put in here because the mission with the story is to put all of Scripture together to see how it's not separate parts just picked out and said, okay, here it talks about something and here it talks about another thing, but instead all of Scripture ties into one narrative that ultimately is meant to intersect God's story with your story and open my eyes, open your eyes to the purpose of all of this. And the hope is that by the time we get done in February of 2016, that we'll all have a great, great sense for what the purpose is that God has created us for. So it's pretty fitting that you start chapter 1 in the beginning of life as we know it, as that video flashed there. And I admit that my own personal journey of faith and trying to figure out what does God want from me, most of my life I was very, very happy to live in naivety. And I had to look up naivety a few years ago because I heard people use that word. And I'm like, what exactly does it mean? Basically, inexperience. Saying I'm okay with just not knowing. I'll be naive about it. And I treated my faith as something like, oh, it's important to me, but I really don't know why I believe. Other than that, I grew up in these, what used to be pews, are now comfy chairs. That would have been nice. I grew up just saying, I'll do it because that's what my family has done. I don't know really why it is I believe. And I think that's where our church and really our friends and family here in Midwest, United States of America, I think that's where most of us sit. That say, hey, I know it. I know God. He probably exists, but ultimately probably isn't good enough. Like, you should be confident either in why you believe or why you don't. You should be confident on whether this story, whether the Bible is true, and why it has and should have an impact on the way you live your daily life and make every decision, or why it's not. And don't waste your time anymore. Now, I'm biased because as I've gone through my own life, I've found so much overwhelming evidence that I would have a heck of a time. That if someone pointed a gun at me today and say, deny it, I would, even though I'd have a lot to lose, I would have a heck of a time denying it. Because there is just too many reasons for me to say, this story is real, and I see very clearly my role in it. And that hasn't always been the case. Like I said, I've lived much of my life in naivety and thinking, that's okay. Like, it's nice to be naive, right? Sometimes. To say, if we were on our way home after church today, it's much more convenient if we don't run into someone on the side of the road who's in need. And if they were on a highway and we run into them because that's the way we go home, just think it'd have been nicer if we would have taken H and we wouldn't have ran into them. Then we never know that we didn't stop. And so in some ways it is nice to be naive. It's nice to be naive to know that right now we can sit here in pretty good comfort because we don't see a starving child sitting across the street, even though we know that exists across the world. Naivety is nice. But when it comes to our faith, naivety cannot be an excuse. Why? Because God says it's not an excuse. He says, you and I will be judged for what we know. And so you say, well, maybe if I never go through the story, I just won't know. And I can still live the life that I really see best. Well, God says, no, actually, you have the story written on your heart. This is in Romans. So we start in the beginning, yet I'm going Romans first. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, is plain to us, because God has shown it to them. For His invisible attributes, namely His eternal power, divine nature, have been clearly perceived since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So we are without excuse. For although they knew God, They did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals, creeping things. What that says is this, is that you better earnestly seek the truth because you will be held accountable for it. Even if you say, well, I just don't think much about God. Well, God thinks much about you. And God has revealed himself to all of us in ways that may not be absolutely clear, but ways that are true. And I can testify to it that even though so much of my life was spent with God and the thought of faith in a supreme being as kind of a secondary thought, I'll live my life and then maybe on a Sunday morning I'll start to think about it. I knew, and I could feel the guiltiness within of saying, something's not right here. And I would imagine you have that same feeling, whether you call it your conscience speaking to you or the Spirit, like you know something is amiss in life. And the evidence of life holds that out true to be true as well. It's just, you know things don't go well. Left to their own, you know most of the time your weeks, something doesn't go right, doesn't go as planned. You know that you feel stress, anxiety, fear, depression, etc. So that's why we have to be earnest in seeking what is real and what is the truth. And the alternative just to say, I'll maybe later or some other time, I think I'm good right now, that's a decision. That's a decision to say, you're probably not all that supreme and not worth paying attention to anyway. So know that to be naive about any of this is a decision to reject God. If God is real, that's a decision to reject him. And that's one of the craziest things about starting in the beginning, chapter 1 of the story, the Bible. Genesis 1:1 said, in the beginning God created. Because that's controversial. Even though we see these wonders around us, it's controversial. Did God really create? And so much so that I listened to a few sermons this week in preparation about guys talking, I'm not even going to go there with the debate of evolution versus creation. But I think it's loud enough that we need to address it first and here when we're talking about this story. Is that there are plenty out there who say, you or I are a fool for thinking that some divine being set this all in motion, created it. You're a fool for believing an ancient text that tells us about this. You're stupid and ignorant. That is the message of many atheists, some more famous than others, but I'm not going to use their names because that's their desire for making such claims as you're a fool or you're ignorant. Because I would say this, I'll make sure I present this right. A lot has been discovered scientifically in the last century. That's true, right? We can agree on that. So much has been revealed to us. And I love the fact that we have an Ivy League educated scientist, doctor of science, in our midst. So we know we have someone who's legit as far as academics go and not some farm boy from Fillmore talking. I know I'm not a farm boy officially anymore, but that's my roots. But science has given us so much in the last century to help us unravel secrets and mysteries that no one in the history of the earth has seen before our time. It's incredible. And so many have taken those revelations of scientific discovery and all these new theories to say, look, the theory of a divine creator is being dismantled before your very eyes. That's why you're stupid to believe it, because we have evidence now that, people 1,000 years ago, they weren't so stupid to believe in God. They couldn't explain it, but now we can, so you're stupid. Well, as my perception of the unraveling of all of this incredible discovery in science in the last century or even the last 20 years, and I believe Ken would agree with this, and Andy back it up with me as elders as well. Actually, it's done nothing but strengthen my belief in a deity. And in fact, the deity of God as revealed to us in the Bible. You say, how could that be? Because so many look at that and say, no, this just proves your naivety about how things really work. And I say, well, actually, as they've discovered, and Ken gave a whole talk on this last year, as you discover and start to see how incredibly complex these things are, you start to see more and more that the probability of this thing happening from random, spontaneous combustion of elements and bacteria that these complex systems could actually arise becomes less and less probable. And the answer of an evolutionist, as defined by someone who believes this was not created by a God, is to say, well, you give anything enough time, enough chance, if there's even a small chance, it could become a reality. And to say, well, those chances are so infinitesimal that what to you is honestly more viable? And that's what the question comes down to, because I cannot and will not attempt to prove to you the existence of God. I can't do it. I would fail miserably. Nor could an evolution theorist get up here and prove to you that God does not exist. It cannot be done. And so you have to answer the question, what's more viable to me, and how all of this got going? How did all of this start? What has better odds? What's more viable? What makes more sense? And so you have two options. You have that a Big Bang started, and even before that, where did that come from? Where did a huge ball of mass even come from? Nothing. Something would have to come from nothing. So you can say, believe Big Bang, set universe in motion, some type of life in that energy was created that spawned up to create our ancestral creatures that eventually had ears, mouth, digestive system, etc. Or you can say there is a God who is powerful enough, who we can never fathom because the creation could never be more than the Creator itself, who set these things in motion as we see it in the Bible, who said, breathe life into existence over the course of 7 days, as we see in Genesis. And so many people get hung up because they're like, well, yes, I read Genesis 1, and I believe in a God. But when you start to unravel Genesis 1 and how God created things, there's things that don't make sense to me. And so then you get hung up like, okay, so is that really true? Can we take the Bible to be truth? Because some scientists make some really good arguments of why that may not be believable. Well, here's the other thing about even those who do believe in a God, and where it really helped me to start when some of these things are challenged, is to say, we read Genesis 1, and we see and we read chapter 1 of the story, and we see how the creation narrative plays out. Now, that very well could have been 7 24-hour days. And there's a lot of convincing evidence that that's what it was. 1 week, just like this week started on Sunday, got to be finished by next Saturday. There is good, believable evidence for that. But I've also known some really faithful, smart people who say, actually, there's good reason to believe these weren't 24-hour days when Genesis refers to it. I'm not making a claim on either one. I think Ken has said what he believes and tends to lean on that argument. But here's my point. That doesn't matter. And you're like, well, shouldn't it matter? It's Genesis 1. If we can't get a starting foundation, shouldn't that matter whether it was a literal 7 days or maybe something much longer that actually the earth is billions of years? And I would say this. No one can prove that it was a literal 7 days. No one can prove that it was billions of years. Again, the same way we can't prove that God exists or doesn't. So in areas that are so gray, and you're like, so far I've told you we can't prove anything. So I'm giving you a bunch of gray here as we start chapter 1. So in areas that are gray, to help get some sense of where does that leave us? Start with what you know. Start with what's black and white. Here's what's black and white. Jesus was a man who was born in Bethlehem, who walked this earth in the Middle East 2,000 years ago, and who proclaimed to be the Son of God, and who proclaimed to be the Messiah and the Savior of the world, and who was crucified on the cross and left the tomb he was in empty. That is documented as well as any other ancient manuscript in history. So if you believe in any sort of literary beef and saying it's got to be true, that story is one of the most believable, accurate stories that we have of ancient history thousands of years ago or more. And so we see historical context that Jesus was real, and good reason to believe that tomb was really empty. That man died on the cross and that tomb was empty. So in that, we know Jesus was real. Jesus himself was referring back to Genesis and the creation of the world. We know, it's okay. In that, we can see that if Jesus was referring back to the Creator, and he never honestly answered whether it was a literal 7 days or not, but what we know is Jesus was real. And so if Jesus was real and he gave credit to the Old Testament, I say so can we. And we start with what we know, that he was real, and so he gives credit to what was laid out in these first groups of the story, and so can we. That's what I believe to be true. So we get to the story of creation, and that kind of gives the preface of it all. But here's our map, which is found in the opening cover of your story book. And so God created heavens and the earth. And you know how the story goes that we don't have to read it verbatim. That he separated the light from the dark, the heavens from the earth, then the earth from the waters, then said, let there be living things, trees and plants and animals to fill the earth, all over. And then he particularly got to the point where he said, I want to create man in our own image, it says. And I want to create them, and I'm going to put them in the garden. And so to give you some context of locations, I really don't think it's that important to know where the Garden of Eden is. It's never been found in our searching. But that is modern-day Iraq, where that circle came up. And that is where the best context possible for where could that Garden of Eden possibly be. And that's where it is. So if you're looking here, this is Israel. And so here we have Italy up here in Europe. This is Israel. And over here in Iraq, where I do not think of the Garden of Eden when I think of Iraq. But that's a probable location of, okay, this is kind of where life started. This is where the hub was. And so that's what we see. Before moving on and talking about Adam and Eve a little bit more, I do want to make one more point about those who think that this is also foolish, to think that this was created. Of asking somebody and examining those who say that God didn't create, or even examining those who say God did create, and say, what are their incentives for doing so? Why would someone not want God to be real? Why would someone not want the truth to be that there is a creator who gave us all life? And more than anything, what I can see is that ultimately, if there is a God, the people who deny him know that they will be held accountable for the way they live their lives and the way they make their decisions. So absolutely, there's a huge incentive to say, I don't want God to be real. Because we all know that if without a God, okay, I can live the way I want, I'm going to be dust anyway. But with a God, we will be held accountable. And as the Bible says, we'll ultimately be judged for that. And then also for me, what would be my incentives for wanting to believe there is a God? Well, my incentives are, it scares the living daylights out of me to think there's not one. And it gives me a hope beyond anything I have ever felt. And that goes back to another area of say, yes, much of this is gray, but what's black and white? What's black and white to me is the fruit of my life. The fruit of the anxiety I experienced as a kid and as a high schooler has almost entirely evaporated when my faith started to make sense to me and grow. That fruit is real. The fruit of my life is I have a wife and kids who I share great joy, love, hope, and peace with. That fruit is real. Does that fruit come in my life without a God and without the knowledge of Jesus Christ and what he stood for and what he taught? I absolutely don't think so. And so anytime you have someone saying, oh, this is a foolish idea, why would you even think about that? Well, you can talk about what we already talked about, but ultimately, ask yourself this question. Of this person who doesn't believe, what's the fruit of their life? Do they have a lot of joy and peace? Because I can tell you, here I stand as personal evidence of someone who does believe and who has a tremendous amount of hope and confidence in my future, the future of my family, and the future of those who I love. That I have many of my questions answered. I have many more that still aren't answered, but I have many of my questions answered. And so think about that as you're starting to be challenged, because we will be challenged on this. And if you're not, you probably don't get out enough. So this is creation. This is the Garden of Eden. Adam, God created Adam. God created Eve. Adam in Hebrew, the name Adam stands for humanity, and Eve stands for life. So the Bible treats Adam. They were real humans, real people created. This wasn't some metaphor. But also we could say it wasn't clearly a metaphor, but it also could act as a metaphor to say God created us all in His image, in the image of a creator. Man and female, He created them. Out of dust, out of nothing. To say it's not likely that God, you say, I believe in God, and He set evolution in motion. No. The Bible tells us differently that He said, here's man, here's woman. There was a little girl once who asked her mommy, said, where did humans come from? And her mom said, well, sweetheart, God in the beginning of time created a man and a woman, and He told them to multiply, be fruitful, have their families, and out of that, your mom and daddy had you, and that's where you came from. And she said, okay. And so she went to her dad and said, Daddy, where did humans come from? How were we created? And he's like, well, dear, see, long ago there was some bacteria that was energized that eventually evolved into apes, which those apes evolved a little bit more than out came humans. And the little girl was pretty confused and pretty distressed and went back to her mom, and she was crying, and she said, Mom, you said that God created us, but Dad said that we evolved from monkeys. And she said, oh, honey, that's easy to explain. I was telling you about my side of the family, and your dad was telling you about his. So I think we know what side we fall on, and that's good to tell amongst us. Those kind of jokes to someone who doesn't believe, probably not the most productive way to win someone over. However, I think it's funny. In that garden, in the creation of man and woman, in the creation of all of earth, God said often, when He was done with the day, He said, separate the heavens and the earth. It's good. I will set light and darkness. It's good. I will set the sun to govern the day. I'll set the moon to govern the night and the stars. And it was good. I will create living creatures of all these kinds to swim, to fly. And it was good. And He said it was good after every day. And then He came to when He created Adam and Eve. And He brought human beings in the image of God. And at the end of the day, what did He say? Is very good. That there was something special about when He cast His breath into human beings that has a distinction from all the rest of the creation. Anybody ever been to any of the natural wonders of the world? Like, I'm talking not the 7 official, but the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, the Grand Canyon, some of the great forests, and that's just all here domestically, but seeing the images of waterfalls and stuff all over this world, and you think, I can't believe this is real. Like, this is incredible. And to think that we have sitting here in our midst and in our homes every day a wonder far greater than even the most majestic mountain. That your life is a creation beyond everything else. Not only yours, as you're able to sit here, but we think about some of the creations that the world would think, oh, you are defective. You weren't, you have some challenges that aren't quite right. You're disabled. And to think, disabled what? You are a wonderful creation. No matter what, you are a life that is distinct from any other piece of God's creation. And you need to start treating life that way. Not just, and a lot of people think, oh yeah, treat others' life, but start with the base, treat your own life that way. Because if you treat your own self as saying, I'm not an accident. I was created for a purpose. then you're going to start living differently. That you are important and you're not alone. And after creation, what happened was that Adam and Eve, God gave them some commands. Like, okay, Adam, name these animals. Adam, Eve, tend this garden, tend this creation of mine. And in that, we find something in the story that God was walking in the garden. And to say we have a first glimpse that God didn't create this as some experiment to be cast off and sit back and say, how's it going? Good, bad, indifferent? But instead, right from the beginning, we saw that he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And it actually refers to that first after Adam and Eve sinned. But I would say it was his practice to walk in the garden. That's what it implies there at the beginning of the story. God was a part of this creation from the beginning. It wasn't meant to be your story and I'll sit back and watch it. God said, this is going to be our story. Why would God want to create in the first place? What's the point? If he's God, couldn't he have everything he wanted? Well, obviously there was something more that in his being he craved. And what he must have craved by creating man in his image was say, I want to share this with somebody else. I want to not live in isolation with me and my son, but instead, this is good, so why not multiply this goodness by creating humans and sharing it with them, that we can do this together. So right now, you may even think, well, I feel very separate from God and whatever I'm going through in life, but we see from the beginning that God wasn't meant to be separate, to say, oh, he's a casual observer. But instead, he says, I want to participate and walk with you through your trials, your pains, and through your joys and glories. One thing about God creating Adam and Eve as well that confuses many and confused me and still does at times is to say, why couldn't he just created them to obey? Why did he have to give them the option to sin? Why did we have to go there? Why couldn't this have been a one-chapter story that ends with, and they all lived happily ever after? Has anyone else wondered that, or am I alone? And one of the things I've found in thinking about that question is to say, you could create something, you could have a child, or in the case of like Pinocchio, the story, said, oh, Geppetto can't have kids, so I'm going to create a puppet. And that puppet, he could control fully and, put a voice to it like, oh, I love you, Geppetto, you're my best friend and all that. And say, I have complete control over my puppet. All right, that's great. But there's no choosing to love me back. There's no sense of you've decided to love me as well. Sarah, if we were in a different culture, I could have said to John, like, hey, I'll give you a goat, make her love me, make her marry me. And maybe I would have taken me up on that if that's what it takes, 2 goats. But I know about our relationship right now is that I know I have a wife who loves me back. And it's her choice that I do not lock the doors when I leave for work and say, you stay there. And if you're not there when I get back, big trouble, Missy. That my wife loves me and wants to stay. And the same goes the other way around. She does not force me to stay in this relationship. Nobody is forced to stay. And just think about Adam and Eve. What if God created humans to say, I am forcing you. I am putting it in your DNA that you will do as I command, that you will be my servants, that you will be my people, instead of giving us the ability to choose him as he chose and to create us, to give us the ability to, in our own free will, choose to love him. What's more gratifying? To have a creation that ultimately has to love you? Or it's not even love in that sense, but instead to give free will to say, hey, if this is real love, I can let you off the leash and say, will you come back to me? And that's why I believe that God gave Adam and Eve the ability to make their choice, even if that choice was counteractive to what God's ultimate purpose was for a perfect creation. And we see then Adam and Eve making that choice to be tempted by the devil. They had one instruction in the story, don't eat from that tree. Was there something special about that apple? I don't think so. I think it could have been a papaya or a banana or whatever else. It was just to say, hey, I'm giving you one test here to see, do you really want to choose me? Do you really believe I've given you everything you need? And we see evil was there present in the garden as well, in the form of a serpent. Satan tempts, and it didn't take much tempting. It didn't take much work. And Eve chose to take a bite, gave it to her husband. He could have taken a stand. He did not. He ate too. And all since then, sin's been wreaking its havoc. So in sin, it's important to understand sin, because sin is really the theme of the rest of the story, and sin and trying to defeat it. And so when you have a good understanding of what sin is, then you have a good understanding of how the story goes and what's really at stake as we see the rest of this narrative play out. I often will say, and Sarah and I in our young life days will often describe sin as, there's two types of sin. There's big S sin and little s sin. And what we often do as a church and get wrong is that we're so concerned with little s sin, with saying, I really should not use some of those curse words. I should really have more patience. I need to work on that this week. I should really love better my neighbor, my wife, my kids. All good. It's good to try to deal with little s sins. But the problem is we're so darn weak to do it, and we fail so often that we're like, this is exhausting to try to improve my life. And what we're missing is that we're so focused on little s sin that we've taken our eye off of the bigger problem, and that's big S sin. It's been described to me as cancer. That if someone has cancer within them, cancer within you will come out as all sorts of ugly symptoms. Bad immune system, which could lead to coughs or nausea or headaches or aches and all these symptoms. And you can do lots to treat individual symptoms. Cough suppressant if you're coughing. You can take anti-nausea medicine and all sorts of things to deal with symptoms of a deeper issue. But unless you find a way to get rid of that cancer, your fight against short-term symptoms is going to be ultimately that, short-term. They will only appear and maybe worse than before. So until you find a way to get at that cancer, to heal it completely, that will take away all the symptoms, that's the only thing that's going to change the game. And so in that, we are going to play out this narrative of, say, sin, big S sin, entered the world when we see Adam and Eve choosing to not believe God. And that sin has been inherited all the way down to here we sit today. All of us with big S sin, with a cancer at the very core of our spirits. And your question is, how are you dealing with it? And my answer to you is, there is nothing that we can do to deal with it. We've inherited it. Everybody before us had it. Everybody after us will have it. We can't do anything about it. So are we in trouble? Alone? Yes. But again, that's why the beauty of seeing the rest of the story play out, to say, but can someone intervene for us to change this picture? When Adam and Eve took a bite of that apple, God could have stomped it out right there and said, game over, scrap the idea. But he didn't. And even after Adam and Eve sinned, he gave the first prophecy that he said, look, I'm not excited that you did not choose to believe me, but I'm not giving up on you. And he said, I think I have the verse. Nope. He said in Genesis 3:15, he said to Satan, it's like, I'll put enmity between you and man, and you will strike his heel, but he will crush your head. And in that, many have said, that's the first glimpse that we say, God is not going to let evil win. That he could just say, I'll scrap this. Satan, you got the best of me there. But instead he says, look, I know, Satan, you're going to continue to bite and claw to take my creation down. But ultimately, we are going to crush your head. I am going to crush your head and defeat evil. And what's that talking about? I think it's talking about Jesus. When he comes, he said, actually, Christ was struck himself. He was crucified on a cross. But ultimately, he rose from the dead and crushed Satan's head. Evil loses the game. That's a little foreshadowing for you in it all. So sin was passed to Cain and Abel. To go through the rest of chapter 1, we see sin transferred. Cain kills Abel, and it starts to get pretty messy pretty fast. And in fact, it just goes on from there that within the first few chapters of the Bible, in the first chapter of the world, God gets to a point where he says, I regret this. These guys are so messed up, I regret this. And that's when we see Noah and his family enter the picture. And what we find with Noah is that God says, I've got to do something about this rampant evil that's taken over. And so you see the ark there. He said, Noah, I want you and your family to build an ark. I'm going to flood this world. In that story, what we find is that God chose one family to find salvation from death, to redeem one family above that sin that had taken over the world. And I think that's also foreshadowing, because we find as a part of Noah's family, those people were saved. 3 sons, their wives, their family, all saved. Next week, we're going to talk about how God starts a chosen family in the Jewish people. And then ultimately, so we see Noah and his family saved. We're going to see the Israelite people, a special family with a special calling to set them apart from the world, to be saved. And ultimately getting to the story of, what's that family now? And it said it's a family in Christ. One family that he says, I'm going to pull you out of the death that sin has caused. So it's ultimately a question of, how do we get into that family? How do we make sure, like, if I was on the outside and saw the ark being built, most of the people were laughing at Noah. But if you knew death was coming, I would have been like, Noah, adoption, please. And right now, that's what I'm asking. He's like, okay, God, whatever family's being saved, adoption, please. May I be adopted to your family? He says, well, how can we be adopted? And he says, well, actually, I've already made it so you can be adopted through my son, Jesus Christ. To be in that family that was saved and redeemed from death. So that's where the ark rested when it landed. That's the Mount Ararat, where it says, supposedly. Nobody knows. And to this day, you see articles almost every year, like, oh, they found Noah's Ark. Oh, really? And that'll make the one thing that make your faith really grow. They can find some of these pieces. I'll tell you this, if you're waiting on them to find the artifacts of the ark for sure, to let your faith grow, you're basing your faith on the wrong stuff. They've searched, they continue to search, and they very well may find something, and they very well may have found remnants of that ark. But don't place your faith on that. So in all of this story, we get to Noah, and that's where we ended today. Chapter 1 ends. We find that even after Noah and that mountain rested, that ark rested on Mount Ararat, they get out of the boat, and we find Noah himself, who was chosen to be on the ark because he was a righteous man before God. We find that he himself slips into sin and darkness. That this big S sin, this cancer, is going to take something phenomenal, extraordinary, to actually cure. It's not going to be cured with trying harder. It's not going to be cured with self-help. It's going to take something spectacular. And we get a little bit of other foreshadowing when we go back to Adam and Eve and say after they sinned, they took a bite of the apple. It said they immediately sewed fig leaves together because they realized they were naked. And once God found them in the garden and they made their excuses, say, oh, this is why we did it, not really our fault. God said, you've changed everything now. It's not the same. And it says what he did for them at that point, instead of just saying, it's done, it's over. He got covers of skin for them to cover themselves. It said covers of skin, and he said if you're looking too fast, you might miss it. To that point, there'd never been death. To get skin, God would have had to kill something. Blood had to be shed because of the sin that had happened from Adam and Eve. So there we get a foreshadowing of to cover over the shame of Adam and Eve, blood has to be shed. And ultimately, that points us to what we're going to talk about in the rest of the Old Testament. We see a lot of animal sacrifices dying to cover over sin, until ultimately, animal sacrifices we see are dealing with small-scale covering of sin till we get to the one who can cover all sin. That's exciting. So we're off and running. And I encourage you, you are going to fall off the wagon likely of this story some point. Don't let it say, oh, I missed a week, or I missed 2, or a month. Keep coming back to it. Because once you understand this full picture, I think it'll change your life. I think it'll change my life. And I'm excited about it. So this morning, we thought Joe had forgotten communion. Stephen helped us out, but we're gonna go without this morning. We're going to watch this video. It's a song we sang earlier today. To end our service and our time together, I want you just to consider creation, what I've said about creation, what God has said about creation, and also consider sin. Big S sin, the cancer that exists in all of us. And consider that God doesn't want to leave you in that condition. Consider that He sees you where you're at, and He cares enough to say, I have a plan to redeem you. So, I think one of the most powerful parts of this, the foreshadowing of Christ, even in chapter 1 of the story, but also to think about if you are challenged by the thought, oh, is it really viable that a God would start all this? To think about what's more viable to you. That something could be created by a supreme God who cares about you, who's compassionate, who loves you, who created you for a purpose? Or is it more viable that something came from nothing? That even with all of the evolutionary biologists and their reasons for how it could have happened, no one can get a good answer of how something came from nothing. And from my mind, I can't imagine how they ever would. But right now, it seems far more viable, the first, to say there's a God who's crazy about you and He loves you. And so that's how my family is going to live. And I want you to seriously consider that question, not because it's socially the right thing to do, but because I believe it's the truth.